Hi Beatle people, welcome back to A Beatleful Life. So in today's video I'm going to be telling you about a new Beatles book that recently was released. It is called Fab Fools, the last untold story of the Beatles. And the publishing company Candy Jar Books very kindly sent me a copy to talk about on my channel. So in today's video I'm going to be doing a kind of summary video on what the book is about. So let's go ahead and get started. So this book was just released in April of this year, and it is a book about the Beatles comedy and their sense of humor and kind of all the comedic things they did throughout their career and after the Beatles. And it also talks about the story of the Beatles kind of parody group called the Ruddles. So it goes kind of chronologically throughout their career, and I have some things highlighted that I'm going to read to you. So I'll start with this quote from the author about the book. It says, "The Beatles weren't just the greatest rock and roll band of all time, they were one of Britain's greatest entertainment exports to the rest of the world, and particularly when it came to my area, comedy." So there's also an interview with that the publishing company did with the author, Jem Roberts. I will link that below in the description. So the book, of course, starts off with their childhoods in Liverpool, and it talks about the Liverpool sense of humor and kind of the humor that they picked up from their families and kind of the programs and comedians that would have influenced them at the time. One of those is a radio program called The Goon Show, and that radio program eventually transitioned to vinyl as well as a TV show as well. And there's a quote from John about the Goons. It says, "Their humor was the only proof that the world was insane. What it means to Americans I can't imagine. As they say in Tibet, you had to be there. Like all my generation, I was really drawn to the Goons. In many ways, they influenced the Beatles as much as rock and roll, Elvis and Little Richard. They were, to my generation, what we were to the next." And then actually, George Martin, who we know obviously became the Beatles producer, he actually had involvement with the Goons vinyl records, so that's an interesting tie-in. And in the early part of the book, it also talks about like a comedy kind of newspaper, like parody newspaper that John created for his schoolmates when he was a kid. It's called the Daily Howl, and there's actually some pictures of it online, but it would have all sorts of like goofy poems and drawings and stuff in it, and it like mirrored what his books would be that he would eventually publish. And actually it says in his first book some of those writings dated back to when he was a kid. So then the book goes into the early days of the Beatles, you know, Hamburg and the Cavern Club, and how they were doing like as much of a comedy show at that time as a music show, and they would do all sorts of crazy stuff, jump into the audience and things like that, and how their person who presented them actually called them the Crazy Beatles, like in German. And then it gets into like when they were actually becoming the Beatles, you know, being signed, how what drew them to George Martin and Brian Epstein was their comedy. And there's another quote here from George Martin. It says, "I guess they quite liked what I've been doing with Peter Sellers and the Goons. Just as they had been bonded together by laughs and had caught Epstein's eye with onstage tomfoolery, it was humor once again which put the Beatles on the next rung of their ladder to the toppermost. When I first signed them, it wasn't because they could write great songs. They had that wonderful electric vibrancy which made me happy, and I knew it would make everyone else happy too." So then it talks about their like radio appearances as the Beatles, and how their sense of humor was able to come out more, and they were more like let off the leash in those circumstances. And then it also talks about their interview humor as the Beatles. We all know their signature humor in interviews, and there's a lot of quotes here. One of the questions was, "Do you wear wigs?" And John answered, "If we do, they must be the only ones with real dandruff." Another question, "How do you sleep at night with your hair so long?" And he said, "Well, when you're asleep at night, you don't notice." And here's another quote from George about their sense of humor, especially in the interviews. He said, "Everyone in Liverpool thinks they're a comedian. Just drive through the Mersey Tunnel and the guy on the tow booth will be a comedian. We've had that born and bred into us, and in our case, the humor was made even stronger by the fact that there were four of us bouncing off one another. If one dried up, somebody else was already there with another fab quip." And it goes on to mention a lot of other well-known comedic moments as well, like John's "rattle your jewelry" quote from the Royal Variety performance. And then it also talks about their Christmas records as well, the fan club Christmas records that they would put out every year, and how like originally they stuck to the script, and then as the years went on they went more and more off the script, and it became more of a zany kind of output. And then it gets into talking about Making of a Hard Day's Night, and how the director, Richard Lester, actually had a background in doing the TV version of The Goon Show. And another thing it mentions is the promotional films that they did, like the one with Help where there's all like fake snow, and the one for I Feel Fine where they're just sitting there eating fish and chips for the whole video. Another thing it mentions is the Beatles cartoon series, which was obviously an American series, and how it wasn't really well received because they didn't think the that the people who created it were able to really capture that Liverpool sense of humor, but it was a big hit when it was on TV for the for the kids. As the years went on, like the Beatles songs obviously didn't match the cartoon versions of them anymore. They were more from the Mop Top era, and then when they started doing things like Strawberry Fields Forever, it didn't fit with the cartoon any longer, so the cartoon ended up being canceled. Then it mentions their other movies as well, Magical Mystery Tour, and how it was like a home movie type of experience putting it together, and how it was very poorly received when it came out. And I think it actually aired on TV in black and white, which really would have like ruined some of the parts of the movie, especially the flying sequence with all the colors and stuff. And George said about Magical Mystery Tour, they really didn't like the film, but that's understandable because from an artistic point of view, it wasn't a brilliantly scripted affair that was executed well. It was like a little home movie. We just had fun. We were supposed to. We were on the bus with crates of beer and an accordionist. And then after Magical Mystery Tour, it goes to talk about Yellow Submarine and how the Beatles, of course, didn't voice their own characters. Here's another quote from George. He says, "I'm not sure why we never did our own voices, but the actors probably did it better because they needed to be more cartoon-like. Our voices were pretty cartoon-like anyway, but the exaggeration that you've got with the actors' voices suits it." And it mentions how the actors who did the Beatles voices actually didn't get credited originally. It says, "The cast were also threatened with anonymity, credited only as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, with the studio concerned that fans would be put off by the absence of the real Beatles." And then it mentions the live action part where the Beatles appear at the end of the film, and it was originally supposed to be a more complex scene, but it got rushed for time. And it actually says, "January 25th, 1968, which is when the scene happened, constitutes the very last time that John, Paul, George, and Ringo got together on screen just to give their fans a laugh." And then it talks about how of course, their music changed after they stopped touring, and how there was a lot of Beatle humor in the Sgt. Pepper album. It says, "With its theatrical intent, it certainly squeezed in more trademark Beatle humor than any previous disc." And then it mentions a quote from George about how there's laughter at the end of Within You, Without You. He says, "After all that long Indian stuff, you want some light relief. It's a release after 5 minutes of sad music. You haven't got to take it all seriously, And then later from the Let It Be period, it talks about You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, that song, and I didn't actually know it started to be recorded in 1967. There is such apt cheek to the eventual placing of You Know My Name as the B-side to Let It Be that it's almost a shame the disc was only the band's penultimate single release. Nothing says Beatles like a record with one of the greatest, universally heart-tugging gospel standards of all time on one side, and a wacky, disjointed novelty song which ends with the passing of gas on the other." Then later in the book, it gets into the post-Beatles comedic ventures and, Ringo's acting and all the movies that he did, and George's involvement with Monty Python things, and John and Yoko's humor as well. So along with the Beatles story in this book, it also talks about the Ruddles, which was a kind of parody spoof group that George was actually involved with and a fan of. And it says, "In fact, as the years went by, he would refer to the Beatles and the Ruddles positively interchangeably, telling Rolling Stone, 'I love the Ruddles because in the end, the Beatles for the Beatles is just tiresome. It needs to be deflated a bit, and I love the idea of the Ruddles taking that burden off us in a way. Everything can be seen as comedy, and the Fab Four are no exception to that.'" And near the end of the book, it says, "The Ruddles were born of a loving desire to prevent us all from drowning in excess seriousness, and there will never be a time when that becomes unnecessary." And then there's a kind of summarizing quote from the end of the book that I also want to include. It says, "It would seem wise to stand up now and warn against losing sight of the Beatles' real X factor, that Liverpool humor with which practically everything they ever did was a wash, that four-headed Fab Fool's charm which marked them out as a totally unique monster in global culture, and which kept those four boys sane amid the whirlwind of Beatlemania." Alright, so that is kind of the summary of this book, again called Fab Fools, The Last Untold Story of the Beatles. I will link 2 links in the description, one of which is an interview that the author did with the publishing company, and then another is a link to order a copy of the book. So thank you to Candy Jar Books for sending me the copy of this book. I do appreciate that. So that is going to do it for today's video. I want to say thank you very much for watching, and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more things like this. And I will also link in the description my blog and social media as always. You can check those out. And as always, have a beautiful day, everybody. Bye-bye.